John Lazur is up next, and they're going to talk to us about articulating multi-faith sacred spaces, placemaking for religious pluralism on the Tufts campus.
Thank you, Anne. I'm just going to get my screen set up. Can everyone see the slides? Okay, perfect. I'm going to set my timer so I don't talk for too long because I know I can. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is John Lazur, as Anne mentioned, and this summer I've been working on a project focusing on sacred spaces on Tufts campus. I'm a rising senior studying anthropology, and I'm really excited to share a little bit about my research and where I hope to take it in the next year. So just a little overview of my presentation today. I'm going to start with a little context about myself and about the project, investigate more specifically the research question that I'm focusing on and the methodology, offer a few initial reflections. I will caveat that with a very clear statement that this project is nowhere near completion, and there are still many conversations and analysis to do. And I'm hoping to touch on a few of the things that have come out, a few of the threads, and then also explain the future aims and questions that I still really want to address. So first, some context about myself. Over the last 3 years, I've been really involved with the interfaith community at Tufts campus. I'm a member of the Interfaith Student Council and a few different religious communities. And I've been really excited and interested in the way that the very diverse set of religious communities and philosophical communities at Tufts share sacred spaces like Goddard Chapel or the Interfaith Center. And just thinking about how it is that they can negotiate those relationships in the space. And as a student of anthropology, I've also been really interested in the fieldwork of the framework of semiotics, the study of signs as a way of looking at how language, objects, and sociolinguistic practices can help function to create community, to re-articulate meaning of spaces, and navigate dynamic social relationships. I'm also inspired by a framework of placemaking, the way that places are imbued with a shared sense of history to help construct communal identities and navigate challenging moments. And there's also something really unique about Tufts, a few things unique about Tufts studying this right now. First of all, Tufts was founded in 1852 by Universalists as a Universalist school, but even in the very original moment, it was founded non-sectarian, as a non-sectarian school, and they had a commitment to making education available for anyone who wanted it. And even today, Tufts is an emblem and an icon of engaged religious pluralism on on college campuses. And I make a distinction here between religious pluralism or interfaith work and what I see as religious diversity or multi-faith. And the distinction that I'm making there is that religious pluralism is a commitment to work with the diversity that is present. I think religious diversity is going to be an aspect of any higher education community, or almost any, but religious pluralism, that unique commitment to collaborate and to communicate across lines of difference, is something that makes Tufts really stand out. And finally, this summer and looking ahead for the next year, physical spaces are in flux as we return from a year of being distanced physically and socially. I think spaces physically are really interesting. So my research question guiding my research broadly is, how have institutional discourses and student communities shaped narratives of religious diversity and pluralism at Tufts and reorganized the use of sacred spaces on campus? And this question was far too broad for just one summer. So I focused specifically on the portion you might see in tan here. How have the narratives of religious diversity and pluralism at Tufts changed over the years? And to address this, I developed a methodology focused on 3 distinct aspects: archival materials, ethnographic theory, and oral histories. And throughout my process, it's really important to keep all of these in conversation with one another. So towards the beginning of the summer, I focused primarily on archival research and ethnographic theory. I was reading theory with an eye towards the materials I was pulling out of bin in Goddard Chapel and the Tufts archives. How was what I was reading helping me understand what I was seeing in the archive? And in the other direction, how were the archival materials pointing to gaps within ethnographic theory? As the summer went on, I transitioned to focus more on working with archives and conducting oral history interviews with students, staff, and faculty. And at this point, the archive became a starting point. Conversation pieces. What were the pieces of history that I couldn't understand just based on those formal materials? Those were the questions I wanted to ask in the oral histories. And oral histories are really important to me because they offer a way to leverage student perspectives and staff perspectives to fill in the gaps and silences present in the archive. As I move forward, I'm really excited to put oral histories into a more analytical framework and think about them through the lens of theoretical frames. So as I mentioned, the project is nowhere near done, and I'm actually conducting more interviews in the next few days, but I wanted to offer a few of the initial reflections. And the first one that I want to focus on is reviewing a little bit of the history of Goddard Chapel. And I have it in quotes here because Goddard Chapel has many histories, but there's one that comes across a lot in archival materials especially, and that's a physical history. One about the slate on the outside, the architecture, the stained glass windows, who was the designer for these windows. And there's one phrase that comes up a lot, that Goddard Chapel was one of the most picturesque buildings of its sort at the time of its construction. But these histories focus primarily on the external facing, the iconicity of the building. And one of the questions I'm really curious about is how has it been used? Who is invited in and whose access is restricted within the space? And so looking a little bit at the use of Goddard Chapel, it actually held mandatory chapel services for all students from its construction in 1883 until the 1940s. This petered out over the decades of the early 1900s due to increasing size of the student body, increasing religious diversity on campus, as well as pressures from other universities for Tufts to fit the mold of a secular research institution. After a few decades of non-use, Goddard Chapel again came to the fore in the 1970s with the formalization of a university chaplaincy as an office. At this point, Goddard Chapel became a space, a center space for interfaith events on campus. While it still was not hosting worship beyond Protestant and Catholic services, it became a space for gatherings for an interfaith community that was starting to grow on campus. And as the years progressed in the 80s and 90s, Goddard Chapel became a center point for student activism, specifically around the South African divestment and sanctuary movement. It also became home for non-Christian worship. In the late 90s, there was a group of Wiccan students, and within the last 2 decades, it has also become home to twice weekly Buddhist meditations and Dharma talks, as well as Hindu pujas. It also now hosts a wider variety of more informal community gatherings focused on building a sense of community and building up the religiously pluralistic community at Tufts. I also want to offer a little bit of the theoretical frameworks that I've been identifying, a few different orientations as to how people are negotiating the relationship between the past and the present within this space and the community at large. The first one that I want to note is one of historical intent and preservation. This framework focuses specifically on the alleged unified intent of the construction of Goddard Chapel, that being that of the founders or Mary T. Goddard herself, and insists on preserving the building in that form. While this certainly leaves a lot to be desired and can do a lot of harm by prioritizing historical intent of an image like St. Paul in stained glass, it does offer a particular motivation for expensive investment, like structural renovations that supported the bell tower in 2000, it was only years away from crumbling. The next framework I want to look at is continuity and timelessness. This framework acknowledges that while changes are needed and change does happen within the space, there's a certain continuity in the founding values or sense of the space. In particular, the notion that religious pluralism was a founding value, or in the, quote, DNA of Tufts, which is a phrase that came up in multiple interviews I conducted. And this is also tied to a sense that the sacredness of the space is somehow timeless. It's something that one can return to even after years or decades of absence. This framework, I think, offers a certain historical precedent and moral legitimacy for otherwise unpopular opinions, like when the university chaplaincy and Goddard became supporters of student activism against the administration in the 80s and 90s. But I think this framework can also hinder us from understanding moments of rupture or resistance to the status quo. And it also focuses too much on the building and doesn't necessarily identify or recognize the labor of students and generosity of communities making Goddard Chapel what it is today, a multi-faith space. The third and final theoretical framework that I want to offer is one of spatial habitus and social relationships. Spatial habitus is a set of conscious or unconscious ways of relating to a particular kind of space. And I really like this framework because it gets away from a sense of a fixed sacred or a unified sacredness within a sacred space. Rather, it uplifts that different communities might relate to a space differently And for them, Goddard Chapel might be sacred, but for different reasons. There are different practices that make it sacred. Or perhaps even during their worship, Goddard Chapel is not a sacred space at all. And I also appreciate this because it uplifts more of the networks of social relationships rather than insisting on looking at the building in its physical structure. However, this framework often dwells too much in the present and doesn't necessarily accept or highlight the historical precedent and contingency of the space. As I move forward with my research, I'm really excited to think more about theoretical frameworks and think about what is the most apt for understanding Goddard Chapel. The chapel is by no means a center point for religious life on Tufts. It is not the center of religious life. It can be one node within an ecosystem, but I want to decenter it as a focus. And that's really where my next research questions are pointing. Where else is sacred space being created and experienced at Tufts? For any number of reasons, Goddard Chapel is primarily only accessible to a small group of students. Notably among these reasons is that it is designed as a space historically to favor able-bodied, white, cis, and Christian identities. One question is, how can sacred space change? And that question, I think, has pushed Tufts University and the University Chaplaincy to invest in other spaces like prayer rooms across campus and the Interfaith Center. And I want to uplift those spaces and start to think about how these are networked together. The other question that I want to investigate is, within one space, whether that's Goddard Chapel or any other space, what are the rituals and sociolinguistic practices that communities employ to distinguish between sacred spaces within that one bounded space? As one of my interviewees noted, Goddard Chapel does serve a lot of roles. It's our Hindu temple, it's our meditation hall, it's a Catholic church, it's a Protestant worship space, it's a humanist gathering spot. Just how is it that all of these communities can exist within the same building? That is the question that I'm really excited to continue working on through the next year. And I want to take a moment to just acknowledge everyone who helped me through this process. First and foremost, to the oral history participants who agreed to talk with me. Without their stories, perspectives, and theorizing, this project would never have been possible. I also want to thank my mentor, Dr. Tatiana Chudakova, and more, Dr. Angeli Falberg, as well as staff from the Tufts University Chaplaincy for their support and guidance throughout this whole process. I want to thank Celebrate Discovery for funding my research this summer, and the Summer Scholars cohort for reminding me that I was never alone. And to all of the Tisch Library staff, and especially Pamela Hopkins and Kim Ferrer-Arnies, thank you for your support and making data collection fun. And finally, to all of my beloveds, thank you for extending your patience to me this summer and filling it with laughter and joy. Thank you.